Buenos días a todos los que nos acompañan. Es un placer para mí presentar esta segunda conferencia magistral, que en esta ocasión estará a cargo de Maaike de Langen. Les voy a platicar un poquito acerca de Maaike de Langen para que sepan quién va a estar en esta segunda conferencia magistral. Actualmente es jefa de investigación del Grupo de Trabajo de Justicia en el Centro de Cooperación Internacional de la Universidad de Nueva York, Estados Unidos. Organización que trabaja para fortalecer enfoques cooperativos entre gobiernos nacionales, organizaciones internacionales y la comunidad política en general para promover la paz, la justicia y la inclusión. Maaike tiene más de 15 años de experiencia liderando programas y equipos nacionales e internacionales en las áreas de gobernabilidad, Estado de Derecho y empoderamiento legal. Bienvenida, Maaike. Ella nos va a presentar la ponencia magistral Justicia para Todas y Todos, innovando para optimizar la resolución y prevención de problemas de las personas sobre justicia. Vamos a escucharla.
Thank you very much, Alejandra.
Muchísimas gracias, Alejandra. Gracias a los organizadores del evento. Es un placer hablar con ustedes. Estoy desde Nueva York.
So let me share my screen, the presentation that I have prepared for you. Let me see. So I will focus on putting people at the center of justice innovation. And I will talk to you a little bit about the global movement that is currently gaining strength on putting people at the center of justice. And that started, well, it didn't really start. There's, of course, many preparatory phases, but a big turning point for people-centered justice was when the United Nations and all the members of the United Nations adopted SDG 16, Global Goal 16, which promises to provide equal access to justice for all. This was in 2015, and a number of countries came together once the goal was adopted to really discuss and work together on how they can take it forward. And one of the first things they did was create the Task Force on Justice. So I was meant to go to my next slide. Yes, there we go. The Task Force on Justice. So this was organized by the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies, which is where I work, the Pathfinders based at NYU. But they created a separate task force, which was led by ministers from Argentina, the Netherlands, Sierra Leone, together with the elders. And the task force had as its task to really look at this promise of providing people-centered justice, providing justice for all by 2030. And it wasn't just the task force and its members, but a whole set of organizations, you can see all the logos here at the bottom, that came together to work on this important task. This was mainly in 2018 and 2019, and it resulted in these reports, Justice for All, as the overall report, which is also available in Spanish. And I do apologize that my slides are in English, but anything that I have on, most of the things I have on my slide, you will be able to find in the Spanish report, which is available on our website. And as you see here, the Justice for All report was the overall outcome, but we worked with all our partners and many different actors on separate reports that were actually inputs to this overall narrative and this overall approach on how we are going to achieve justice for all by 2030. And the one I wanted to point out for this audience in particular is the one that you see there in the middle, Innovating Justice, Needed and Possible. So we have a separate report on justice innovations that really is an important resource if you want to get inspiration for all kinds of different innovations that are taking place across the world. It is it has a number of a lot of examples and also links where you can find more information. So please have a look at our website to find that report. What we did in this report is not just publish a report, but it's really bring together evidence and experiences from around the world to help us find the evidence and the data that we need to be able to provide justice for all by 2030. And we also strengthened the political leadership and the mobilization and bringing everyone together. And one of the key things we did is to really shift the thinking from, is it access to the justice system as it is, or is it a whole different way of thinking about what the justice system really is and should be providing to people? And we did that with three main focus areas. So the first question we answered is, why do we need justice for all? And what needs to be done between when we adopted Goal 16 and 2030, which is the end deadline of the 2030 agenda. We call that the global justice gap, the gap between the justice that people want and need and the justice that systems currently provide. Now, the global justice gap, you may have heard this number in other presentations, is 5.1 billion people who are deprived of justice. And this has different categories of people that we then combine to reach this overall number. So 4.5 billion people across the world are excluded from social, economic, and political opportunities because they do not have the papers, they do not have the identity documents, they do not have a contract for their work or for their house. And so with that, they have already difficulty to have access to justice. 1.5 billion people have a criminal, civil, or administrative justice problem they cannot resolve. And that is based on data from the World Justice Project, which has done surveys across the world to find this number. And then there's a smaller group, but very significant group of people, 253 million people, who live in extreme conditions of injustice without any meaningful legal protections, apologies. And that includes people who are stateless, people who live in modern slavery, and people who live in war zones where there is no justice system to speak of. We also made the financial case or the business case for justice in the report. And what we found, using again data from the World Justice Project and working together with the OECD, is that everyday justice problems, those unresolved justice problems that we mentioned, actually cost countries 0.5 to 3% of their GDP. So leaving all those problems unresolved and not meeting the needs of people in the justice sector is actually a cost to countries and to their economy. We also calculated what it would cost if we wanted to provide access to basic justice services in low, middle, and income countries. So as you can see on this slide, on low income countries, it would cost $20 per person per year to provide access to basic justice services. In middle income countries, $64, and in high income countries, $190. And the differences between those numbers are mostly explained by differences in salary levels. So this is an important piece if we want to say that justice is important, if we want to ask for more investment in justice. These numbers and this analysis is an important part of that discussion. We then focused on improving people's justice journeys, and because of the time, I won't go through all of this because it's it will take me much more time than we have. But just to highlight that if we want to improve people's access to justice, it's really three components of the justice journey that you can focus on: empowering people and communities, providing access to people-centered justice services, and fair outcomes. And in the report, we have combined evidence and examples from around the world on how that can be done, what works to improve people's justice journeys. We had that whole agenda set out, and then of course, as in every sector, everything changed when the pandemic hit. So we did some additional analysis, and I would like to share some of the insight what we saw in 2020. So first, the analysis we did, we focused on justice for all in the public health emergency. And what we saw there, and this was very much in the early stages of the pandemic when there were lockdowns and when country after country was going through this phase of, making decisions and trying to limit the impact of the pandemic. Firstly, we saw that justice actors were suddenly on the front line of the coronavirus pandemic. So a lot of attention actually went to the health sector. But in reality, justice actors, the police, judges, paralegals, lawyers, they had a very important role to play because all these decisions were being taken. There was suddenly a change in the way the whole sector operated. And of course, there was the shadow pandemic, as UN Women calls it, the increase in violence against women that was seen across the board, and also the need for different ways to respond to that. So that is the public health emergency and how justice actors had to play a role in that, and we provide some advice on that. And interestingly, in that report, and again, this was early April, so it was very early days for the pandemic. We had the chair of our task force, Hina Jilani, who is a human rights lawyer from Pakistan, help us write the foreword to this report. And she wrote, and it was early days, so I think it's much more common now, but she wrote that it's not just a health pandemic, it is also a pandemic of human rights. It is a crisis of human rights, and all kinds of people's rights have been shifted, actors have a different role to play. So I think that's a very important piece to keep in mind. We also looked at the economic crisis. This came a little bit later, this report we published in July. And there we went through, we know from the Justice for All report that there are people face a common justice problem. So while every legal system is different, the problems that people face are actually quite shared across countries. Everywhere there's debts, there's divorce, there's bankruptcies, there's evictions, there's access to public services. Every system has different rules and regulations, but everywhere people face those similar problems. And so you can learn from each other and collaborate. So the three things we've seen actually in 2020 that are relevant, I think, for our sector is one, innovation. Of course, that's what this whole conference is about, that I hope many of you who are listening are working on justice innovation. And it's actually interesting how in many legal systems, in many courts, in many lawyers, in many paralegal organizations, many legal aid providers, they had small innovation projects already going on for years, and there were pilots and there were experiments, but it was never really hit. It never really hit the mainstream. And I think because of the pandemic, that has been really thrust forward, and we have much more progress than we've had for many years. And I heard somebody say in a meeting, actually in April, I think, very early days, that the justice system was sort of thrown straight from the 19th century into the 21st century because of the pandemic. Suddenly there couldn't be in-person cases, so everything had to go digital, and all those innovations that had been kept at a very small scale or even resisted became much more common and much more seemed possible just because we had to find solutions. So that's the second point. The creativity that was shown, I think, in 2020 is much larger than it has been for many years, simply because the situation required everybody to look at what was possible. How can we continue? The way we've always worked doesn't work anymore. We have to rethink our procedures and our work. And then the third point on justice in a pandemic is collaboration. Again, because of the tremendous changes and the tremendous challenges, there was suddenly much more room for collaboration between different actors. I've mentioned them before. You have the police, you have the courts, the lawyers, the paralegals, the legal aid providers. All those actors had to be creative and work together. So I think there's been an increase in collaboration. That's not to say that the pandemic was a good thing, of course, even apart from the terrible health impacts, the many people who have died, and the economic crisis. Also for our sector, I do see some of those positive developments that I've mentioned, but I also think we are in a difficult situation. We've called this the triple crunch. On the one hand, there's more justice problems in the economic crisis, and my sense is, and our shared sense is, that is actually going to keep increasing over the coming month, because people's reserves are running thin, people's financial possibilities are being exhausted, companies are going bankrupt. So there's a wave of justice problems that is building. At the same time, the restrictions on operations caused by the pandemic are still in effect. We are not out of the woods. We have some positive news about vaccines. I think everybody is hoping that will come sooner rather than later. But the reality is, for at least the coming half year, maybe longer, the restrictions on our operations will still be in place. And then public funding for justice is under pressure. Public funding in general is under pressure. And that will impact the justice sector too. In short, we will have to do more with less. Now, for people interested in justice innovation, I think that is also, again, in a way, good news, because the only way to do more with less is when you innovate. And I think people who are willing to find solutions and able to produce solutions and to innovate will have a good environment for those ideas and those projects. So let me turn then to the last slide that I have, and some key points that I think are important if we talk about people-centered justice innovation. The first is put people at the center. That is, as you've seen, the core of our approach. And that means to look at different groups of people, to look at where people are, what their capabilities are, making a difference between adults and children, making a difference if you want to reach men or women, looking at specific groups who are in a situation of vulnerability, and tailoring your approaches to what they can, how you communicate with them. It means putting a focus on people's lives and enabling them to get on with their lives, to solve those justice problems. And it means also, very important in the 2030 agenda, to leave no one behind. 2 is to focus on resolving justice problems. So that requires not just taking a narrow justice focus of what is the issue at hand, but taking a broader perspective. What are the underlying problems? If you look, for example, at divorce or at inheritance, or problems between landlords and tenants, the relationship always focuses on a specific item of conflict, but our approach needs to be conflict sensitive, needs to be take a broader perspective and really try to address those underlying issues as well. And there are possibilities to do that. For example, if you create a platform for dispute resolution, you can design that in a way that it encourages people to actually resolve those problems. The third is to create better justice journeys. And you've seen the slide that I had on about those different components of the justice journey. The critical part, I think, is not to digitalize the process as we know it. And this is sort of what is often done. We know how the process runs and we make every step digital. But I would challenge everyone to really use this opportunity to rethink the process. I use as an example when you look at your iPhone, you have the little icon to make a phone call. And it's actually a horn of an old phone, the one that you used to pick up and then make the phone call. My daughters have no idea what that icon is for, where it comes from. They have never seen an actual physical phone the way we had them before we had our mobile phone. So you have to, digitalize the process. Improve the process while you're digitalizing it, and not digitalizing the existing process, because we have seen that those don't work. The fourth point to keep in mind, and I think this links to what I've said earlier, open up to different actors. Many people in the justice sector are used to working in silos and with fixed roles. I think some of that has been shifting in the past year because of the situation we were in. But encourage those collaborations, try to work together between different actors and also from different sectors. So if there's a health problem, work together with health providers, create those legal medical partnerships that are springing up in different countries, create multidisciplinary teams to also include social workers, for example, if you talk about accessing public services. Another important one, especially for innovation, again, is to create standard solutions with individual escape routes. I said earlier, we need to do more with less, and one way of doing that is standardizing. Of course, there are many cases that are comparable, and you can have some economies of scale if you standardize solutions. However, because we are working in the justice sector and often as public sector providers, we need to make sure that we have the right balance between standardizing the solutions that can be scaled up and be more efficient with individual escape routes. Because if somebody is in a process that is digitalized, or that is one of those standard trajectories, there may be situations where that are different. So people have to be able to either appeal or find a way out, reach out to someone, not get stuck in the standard solution. I think finding the right balance is very critical to justice innovation. collect data, learn and improve. I think this is more natural to innovators than it is to many other justice actors. Those are focused on innovation know that you can start with something and then collect the data and improve it as you go along. In collecting that data, of course, it is again important to take the people-centered perspective, not only take data from the system, but ask people for feedback. What are their perspectives on the process, on the outcome, on the fairness that is created. So collecting that data, collecting justice data, both from inside but also from people through surveys is quite critical, and then learn and improve as you go along. And that links actually quite nicely to my last point, which is if we want to prevent justice problems from happening, we need to get to structural improvements. And we can do that by learning from individual cases. So whenever you design, whether it's a database or a platform, whatever innovation you are working on, make sure you keep in mind that in the design, you set it up in a way that the information from those individual cases can be brought together so that you can make structural improvements. You can learn from those individual cases, and you can actually improve the process of public sector services or justice delivery as you go along. So I feel like I've been talking for a long time. I would be very happy to answer some of the questions that may be coming from the audience. And let me stop sharing my screen. Muchas gracias. That's about as far as my Spanish goes, unfortunately. But thank you for your attention, and I look forward to answering some of your questions.
Muchas gracias, Maaike. Sí, por supuesto que los temas que acabas de abordar.
Thank you, Maaike. I believe that the topics you touched upon are very important, especially for those of us who deal with justice. When it comes to justice for the pandemic, access to justice, the people that have to do with innovation, rethinking justice in these times. These are all very important aspects. But to me, what catches my eye, and this is something that I would like to focus on when if you would like to field a few questions. Well, first off, justice for everybody is a priority. And I would like to ask you, when you talk about empowering people and communities, and you tell us that you have registered information and collected information and data around the world on this, please tell us about the experiences that you've had regarding how can we encourage people to participate in justice, and maybe the scope of this topic is too broad, but how can we increase the understanding of law in people at large, in the public at large?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think there are a number of ways. One is, I mentioned and I showed you some of the data, and that is data collection. So justice needs surveys. We have two partners who do a lot of work on justice data. That is the World Justice Project and HIL, HIIL. That is an institute that does justice needs and satisfaction surveys. So going out and asking people what their justice problems are and whether they are satisfied with the way they are resolved is an important part of that. And some good news actually just on the justice data very quickly is that just in March, a new indicator was adopted, which sounds a bit technical, but a new indicator to actually measure progress against SDG 16 was adopted, which will take that data from legal needs surveys, which is going out to people and asking what they need from the justice sector. And it is UNDP, UNODC, and the OECD who are working together to promote those kind of surveys. That's just collecting the data. Another important part is I mentioned different actors. So I think paralegals, community organizations, there are many organizations, whether they are government driven or whether they are from the civil society or grassroots organizations that are really based in the community. So they know where the people are, they know what people's problems are, and finding the ways to connect that information to feed up into the justice system is an important aspect to get people's participation, if not directly, then at least indirectly. Of course, people themselves are increasingly able to orient themselves on what's available in terms of laws with online platforms. So I think there's a lot is possible, but it does require engagement from citizens, and often these intermediaries. I know in some Latin American countries there are facilitadores or justice facilitators. There's all kinds of shapes of people who make that connection between people's daily lives and the justice system. Back over to you, Alejandra.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. We have another question, and I believe this is the last one we're going to field because we are running out of time, unfortunately. Are there examples of practices in this crisis of justice that we're living through, specifically in the case of women?
Yes, there are some examples, and it is of course, as I mentioned, UN Women has drawn attention to the shadow pandemic of violence against women, and there have been a whole series on our website. There's a collection of responses, but just to give you a few, I mean, in the early stages of the pandemic, some countries actually created new safe houses in hotel rooms that were available, or they have created pop-up centers so that women who were going out to do shopping could actually also get information about a situation of vulnerability or violence that they wanted to escape. Many paralegal organizations have started phone lines and hotlines that people can call. And there's several code words that have been developed in different countries if women wanted to signal that they were in a situation of danger. The other thing, which is more of the longer term perspective, I guess, on protecting women from violence, is empowerment, also financial and economic empowerment. I think in some countries there's still progress to be made on allowing women to participate fully in the economy. And empowering them economically will also empower them and allow them to better stand up for themselves. And legal empowerment, of course, by knowing what the situations are and knowing where they can find support if they need it.
Muchas gracias, Maaike.
Thank you very much, Maaike. This information, when it comes to access to justice and making sure that justice reaches as many people as possible, and all communities will always represent a challenge. This is something that we have to work on. And now that we have the pandemic, that adds up to the number of problems and challenges that we have to face. But when it comes to justice for everybody, we have to thank you profusely for the work you do, because it is so necessary to attend to the needs of victims that we have, not only here in Mexico, but in the rest of the world. Thank you very much for your participation. We're so happy to have you here in this very first forum for justice. And the only thing that I have left is to thank you and all the people that are watching us and the participants. Once more, thank you for your attention.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.